Hello, hello, hello. Welcome as people slowly enter the room. Happy August 17th. You are with us at the Cultural Policy Action Lab, a national professional development program supported by Grantmakers in the Arts. Good morning to the people on the West Coast. Good afternoon to those in the Mountain, Central, and Eastern time zones. We're really happy to have you here with us. My name is Randy Engstrom. I use he, him pronouns. I come from the unceded territories of the Duwamish and the Muckleshoot, the Coast Salish territories of the Pacific Northwest. And I'm really happy to be with all of you today. There is nowhere I would rather spend my birthday than with all of you on a webinar talking about cultural policy and racial equity. And I actually mean that. That is something I love. We're very happy to have you with us today. We're really excited to share with you the presenters that are joining us. And just a little bit of housekeeping. Closed captioning is enabled. There is both a chat and a Q&A feature. You can ask the panelists or any of us questions throughout the presentation. There will also be time for a Q&A at the end. And we're really excited to have everybody with us today. Also note, this will be recorded. So if you miss anything, you'll have a chance to go back, and all of the recordings for this session and the 5 previous can be found on the Grantmakers in the Arts website under the Cultural Policy Action Lab link. With that, I will turn it over to my friend and colleague, Estrella Escalín.
Hi again, and welcome. Next slide. The Cultural Policy Action Lab and Learning Series is a leadership and professional development community of practice program. It's designed for public sector workers who seek to advance racial equity through arts and culture through public policy. We are continuing this 8-part learning series with the 5th session on creative workforce development. My name is Estrella Esquilin. I use she, her pronouns. I am a cultural strategist and co-designer of this program, along with my collaborators, Jen Cole and Randy Engstrom, with generous support by the Grantmakers in the Arts team. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Estrella. Even in this never-ending time of COVID-19, when we're all physically distanced and dispersed across the US, we'd like to recognize that we are all grounded and connected to Grantmakers in the Arts, our funders and partners in this work, which is located on Lenape land in what is now New York City. This acknowledgement is meant to be a means to recognize the history and legacy of that colonialism that displaced the first peoples there, and where we are speaking to you from today. We are all connected to sanctioned and unsanctioned policies and continue to benefit from that legacy through our compensation to facilitate and host this session today. In addition to shifting policy in the public sector, which is why we're here and gathered to discuss, as a beginning step in the work to dismantle and own our internal and structural colonialism beyond this territory acknowledgement, something you can do is to support these tribes and institutions in this critical time through resource and financial donations. For more information, please check out the links that we're going to put in the chat, but we recommend you investigate and consider supporting the NDN Collective, Native Women Lead, the First Peoples Fund, Native Arts and Cultures Foundation, all tremendous organizations, all worthy of your support. With that, I get to introduce 2 really remarkable human beings who are doing really incredible work at a time that's super important. Anyone who has navigated the cultural ecology or the creative economy for the last 2.5 years is well aware of the needs around our creative workforce and the needs of creative workers and artists. And these 2 folks based in Illinois are doing remarkable work to that end. So I would love to welcome Claire Rice, Executive Director of the Arts Alliance of Illinois, and Julio Rodriguez, Deputy Director of the Office of Employment and Training, the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, to join us today. I know we may have Julio joining us via audio and Claire joining us via video, but we're really happy to have you both here in any form to talk about your work and to collaborate with all the folks here today. So Claire, welcome. It's so nice to see you.
It's great to see you too, Randy. Thank you so much. We are still working on getting Julio in the room here, but I'm confident he will be with us shortly, and very, very happy to be with all of you in this incredibly important series. It's been great to see the first few sessions, and so honored to participate in this one on creative workforce development. So I thought we'd get started, and Julio will join us shortly by talking a little bit about, who I am and who Julio is, and then we can talk about sort of our work together and how it's evolved. So as you can see from the titles there, I'm the Executive Director of Arts Alliance Illinois. Arts Alliance Illinois is our creative sector advocacy organization here. We work statewide to champion arts policies and resources that benefit our members and all Illinois residents. Traditionally for us, that's meant a lot of advocacy for public funding, a lot of advocacy for policy to change that supports artists and creative organizations. And then more recently, that's meant us really entering into this workforce space, not just as a result of the pandemic. In fact, Julio and I met maybe a year and a half before the pandemic started, through colleagues here in Illinois that were interested in creative entrepreneurship and creative sector entrepreneurship. And we started actually thinking about workforce development within the context of the creative economy, within the context of creative industries. So Julio says he's here, but on mute, so needs to be unmuted. So I'm not sure where he is, but that's for Estrella, Randy, or Jen to think about or work on. And our original connection, as I said, was to start to think about a prioritization for the creative workforce outside of a pandemic context. And then the pandemic, we actually had, I think, 2 or 3 meetings about what might that look like, kind of started with film, and then the pandemic hit and our relationship changed pretty dramatically, as all relationships in the sector did, right? And we've really been thinking about what does it look like to integrate artists and workforce pipelines, both within and outside of the creative context. So we'll talk about all of those things today. I will talk a little bit first, if we want to go to the next slide, about our general strategy around creative workforce interventions in Illinois. 2 of those really involve Julio and his team at the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. 2 of them are really driven internally at Arts Alliance through policy change and also through other programmatic interventions. So this first thread, you'll see Illinois Creative Workforce Investment, is really about that workforce development thread within the creative economy. And here in Illinois, we've started with film as because of the film tax credit, we've been able to expand in the last year, in fact, but has been in place for a number of years here in Illinois. So film was the right place for us to start. And also, as you all know, film has tentacles throughout the creative economy. So it was a kind of a great kind of gateway for us with workforce. The responsiveness thread was really about short-term project-based hiring. I think we've seen a lot of this across the country in different states. The kind of mini WPA projects that we've seen, where we're getting artists back to work as quickly as possible in a variety of civic and social umbrellas. The Illinois Creative Workforce Activation Project is something we're really piloting here and that we'll spend quite a bit of time on today. And then this idea of Illinois Creative Workforce Stabilization are really the underlying policy implications and interventions that we need to take action on that are not exclusive to the creative sector, that are really, most cases, some are particular to our workers in our industry, but most of them are things that we need to partner on as an advocacy and policy entity to assure that creatives are included in things like portable benefits, workforce protections, cash assistance programs, et cetera, so that they are actually, cohesively thought of as workers in this economy, and not necessarily siloed or segmented out in terms of eligibility or participation in those. When I see Julio has joined us via phone. Great to have you, Julio. So I'm gonna, and because we're really short on time for Julio, I'm gonna come back to film and so maybe let's skip forward 2 slides, Randy, and get right into Julio's slides so that one more. And then we'll get Julio talking about how Workforce Works. And then I can come back and talk a little bit more about the creative application, creative intervention, because he's at the National Governors Association conference and has to present next. So I'm going to turn it over to Julio for the quick and dirty.
Yes. Thank you, Claire. I really appreciate that. And I apologize to all of you, but technology is not my friend today. So quickly, just to give you some context, I'm actually here at the National Governors Association with all of my counterparts across the country. And the way that I want to kind of preface this is a lot of our funding in most states comes through what we call the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And that fund, if you're looking at the slide, as you can see, it's federal, then state, and then goes to local areas. And to give you an example of what we mean by local areas, so in the state of Illinois, we have 22 local workforce areas. And one example is Cook County, Chicago, which is the 2nd largest actually local workforce area in the country. And that encompasses not only the city of Chicago, but the outlining suburban areas under the county. And 90% of our funds go to these local workforce areas, but then we have about 10% of the funding that we get. And to give you a sense of funding, so the state of Illinois receives about $135 million that can be expended into sort of 3 categories: adults who've been long-term unemployed, dislocated workers, which is the category we're most interested for this conversation, and then youth, which I would say is another category that we want to be interested in. And within those 3 categories, each of these local workforce areas can provide job training funds to both individuals by reimbursing their training at either like a community college, a university, or a community-based organization that provides funding or training, or an association that provides funding, or organizations like the trades that provide union opportunities, like in carpentry or electricians, or in the electricians world. One of the things I've learned is how much the sort of trades play a role in the whole creative arts industry, and that there's a real partnership there, especially when it comes to set design and a number of other areas. But these 22 local areas in our state basically receive funds that they can use towards those 3 types of populations. And then within those populations, they can provide anything from, as I said, reimbursement to training for individuals, what we call classroom-sized training, which is a group of individuals interested in receiving the same types of credentials for training, people who are already working but need to be upskilled, and then folks who lost their jobs by no fault of their own, such as many of the folks in the creative arts who were impacted by COVID, and then youth, anywhere between the ages of 14 and 24, and there is a lot of career services and career pathways work, including apprenticeship programs. Next slide, if you haven't done it already. The regulations and policies, those are all very prescriptive from the Department of Labor, but one of the things that each state can do is that they can actually prioritize certain industries, certain populations, and actually use both their state and local funds to serve those populations. Each one of those local workforce areas are made up of boards that represent 51% businesses, and then the other groups represent both labor, various nonprofits, education, And the idea there is to have the key stakeholders in an area making decisions about where to put funding. In the state of Illinois, most recently, in a lot of our funding opportunities that we put out both at the state and in some of the local areas have actually made the creative arts industry a priority, and people who've been in the creative arts that have been impacted by COVID as a priority population as well as a priority sector. Next slide. So when you get into sort of the service delivery, again, this is Illinois' model. As you can see, it really is sort of 4 organizations or agencies at the state level that control much of the funding that goes to these local 22 areas. And they include our community college board that does the adult education programs. It includes the Department of Employment Security, which handles UI and reemployment, as well as our Department of Commerce, which handles all the training and career services, and then Voc Rehabilitation, which really handles a lot of resources related to people with disabilities. Now, one of the things I want to point out is under COVID, one of the changes at the federal level was that UI was made available to many folks in the creative arts. Unfortunately, because it was done so rapidly, there were a lot of things that were not really thought about. And so it made it very difficult for folks in the creative arts to really fully take advantage of unemployment insurance. And it was very challenging because of the way that unemployment insurance is calculated. So one of the things, policy changes that Claire and I have talked about, especially at the federal level, is one, to continue access for folks in the creative arts as independent contractors to UI, but also to relook at the formula so it's actually a better resource than it was during COVID, and so that in subsequent years it becomes a real opportunity for people to at least have resources when they're displaced from a particular position. But there's a lot of work that has to go into that because of the way that unemployment insurance is structured, how people pay into it in terms of employers. So looking at those factors is going to be critical. So moving on, and I'm sorry I'm going so quickly. As you can see, I kind of talked already a little bit about sort of the various programs, and I'm trying to highlight the ones that I think make the most relevance to all of you. So again, I talked a little bit about what our department does, what the Community College Board does. Career and Technical Education is a really critical fund. It is part of the larger education funding that goes to both secondary and post-secondary education. Those are real opportunities. Again, there's a lot being discussed at the federal level about the reauthorization of the Higher Bill Act or the Higher Education Act. And that is an area that I think there's opportunities for the creative arts and thinking about how do we fund accelerated programs, particularly for folks who are creative, to be able to earn credentials that complement their creative skills, but also allow them flexibility and, quite frankly, more opportunities to earn additional income or actually become supplemental to their creative arts income, or become a way for them when their creative work falters, for them to have an opportunity to work in another industry where they can apply their skills, but also be able to have a better and more stable income and possibly a higher income as a result of being able to apply those skills in a variety of different settings beyond the creative arts. Some examples are human services, education, healthcare, IT, even in advanced manufacturing, where a lot of creatives have very transferable skills. And I know Claire will talk a little bit about that. Is how do we take the skills that creatives have and really do a crosswalk on where are their occupations and industries that where they can really take advantage. But these are some of the programs that each of the departments have in the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. I won't go into them. A lot of them are not necessarily relevant to what we're trying to do here in the creative. This So I jumped a couple of slides and went to slide 18. And so flexible training models for the situation. I already talked a little bit about individual training accounts, and those folks in the creatives would be eligible for bridge training. So those are particularly useful for young people who maybe lack some basic remedial education, maybe have less school without a GED or a high school diploma, and want to go into the creative field, but need real strong academic training in order for them to be able to compete for the types of jobs and occupations there. Classroom size training, again, this is an opportunity to sort of pick a particular occupation or set of credentials and create a classroom training site that would help bring a larger pool of or cohorts of people into programs. On-the-job training is a learn and earn model, very similar to apprenticeship programs. And incumbent worker are trainings for people who already are already working but need to upskill their credentials and really need to think about how can they advance their competencies in key areas to make them marketable either in their existing industry or to maybe possibly other sectors. Again, and under our particular funding as a state, we have our formula grants that go to local workforce areas. We have grants that are specifically targeted at industries that have had layoffs or have had major downturns, and those are what we call our rapid response grants. And then some of our more discretionary grants are talent pipeline management, which is really one of the things that we're looking for the creatives, where we're trying to think about how do we navigate and actually coordinate all of the sort of creative industries and begin to think about how to work with employers in those industries to map out a talent pipeline that can help build talent pools throughout the pipeline. Won't talk about TRADE Act because it's not really relevant here. And then again, federal programs that are also things that we apply for that help us expand our resources. Again, this just gives you a breakdown of our funding over the last couple of years. The last thing I will say is in the state of Illinois, we have over the last year, and this is true for many states, because of ARPA funding, there has been greater opportunities to create state programs that don't often have all of the requirements that some of the federal programs have, and really allow for more creativity of the workforce system. One example of that here in Illinois is our job training and education development grant. That grant particularly is actually targeting creatives who have been impacted by COVID to help get them additional skill development so that they can look at other occupations that could be complementary to the skill sets they have. So now I'm going to breathe and I'll take questions if you'd like. But that's sort of what, and many of the states have very, very similar systems. They may be structured differently, but in terms of funding, it comes down from the feds. 90% of it goes out to the local areas. Each state can hold up to 10% of the funds that they were given to do statewide activities, sponsor creative type pilots or demonstration programs. But ultimately, the goal is to try to get local workforce areas to make investments in key sectors within their local areas. And the creative industry crosses many, many, many areas of any state and many, many other sectors beyond just sort of the creative sector. Stop there.
I found this on the web.
Hello?
Yeah, Julio, thank you. I'm gonna just ask Estrella, Randy, and Jen if there are any specific questions for Julio, we should probably take them now, just as a little quick pivot. And then I can kind of take back over once he has to jump off with some of the programs we've been working on here in Illinois.
There is one. Oh, go ahead, Jen. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, so Julio, there's a question in the Q&A. You mentioned a talent pipeline management evaluation. What sectors or examples have you seen that have done this well in Illinois or elsewhere?
Yeah, so the sectors that have been most successful with the talent pipeline have both been healthcare and manufacturing. Partly because those are two particular sectors that are in sort of critical needs. I'll give you an example. In the state of Minnesota, one of their largest healthcare providers has over 4,000 open positions within their hospital systems. They are actually currently offering $50,000 bonus for nurses to sign up to work in their hospitals. I mean, so, and I would say manufacturing, especially advanced manufacturing, there's that talent pipeline where it's not only looking at your current sort of workforce needs, but what are your future needs and what are the pools of people that you may not have thought about that you can bring into your industry. And I will, again, I'll give another example of, you know, there's a huge teacher shortage across the country. Claire and I have talked about how many folks in the creatives have worked with schools, but oftentimes have not thought about, well, maybe if I got a credential in teaching, I might be able to become a substitute teacher and be able to augment when my, you know, when my creative work is slow, to be able to do substitute teaching, or even think about becoming a teacher and doing more of my work in a more sort of seasonal kind of a way. But I think that's where the talent pipeline grants are really helpful, and why we want to do something specifically in the creative to really talk with industry and really figure out what are those sort of pain points they have currently and where do they see future growth within the industry. Film is probably the best example of where there's great opportunity, because at least in the state of Illinois, we've seen enormous growth even during COVID. And that industry is really, as part of the creative industry, has really become, we see real opportunity for continued growth and stability there.
And one of the things Claire will address when she sort of talks is a little bit about how, like, how we're beginning to think about creative workers in professions that are evolving, right? So one of the talent pipeline issues is that it's easy, it's like for known professions and professions that are clear and understood, like nurses and LPNs and teachers, like we know what those jobs are. One of the other issues and the opportunity really for creative workers is to really think about what are these jobs that are evolving and becoming, and how are we better articulating the talents that creative individuals naturally have into these emerging sectors and these jobs that don't exist now but will in 5 years. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later. Go ahead, Julio.
Yeah, and I would say one of the things that, you know, we just had LinkedIn and Deloitte just talk about what are the key sort of major skill sets that all employers are looking for. And it probably wouldn't surprise many of you that they're looking for people who are natural problem solvers, self-starters, people who can bring an innovation, an idea to the table that lends itself to being, to pushing an industry in a different direction, be able to work in teams, be able to build off of a group's strengths. And those are really very tangible skill sets that many creatives learn as part of the work that they do in the area of their particular artistic bent. Obviously, if you're a carpenter, you can create sets. If you're somebody who does art, be creating websites or, you know, platforms. That, you know, gaming is a big area where a lot of creatives either get their start or go into because of the flexibility of the occupation and the flexibility of the work schedules.
Great. Do we have any? I know Julio's got to go on and talk to some governors. Are there any other questions for Julio?
Jen, I had one sort of building off what Julio mentioned about the also I should go into nursing because that kind of a bonus sounds amazing. But the Minnesota example that Julio gave and Amanda's question about case studies, the last session we had in the Cultural Policy Action Lab was about arts education, and I'm curious about the movement from arts education into career tech ed and career pathways. And have you seen promising examples in the arts educational space where they've been able to take advantage of some of that career tech ed, career pathway investment towards creative learning and creative jobs?
I haven't personally, but I think that's part of our trying to create this sort of talent navigator, is to really start to sort of go out and really find these programs that are happening, because I think there are many more programs than we realize, especially as a result of COVID, that we need to first catalog and figure out how they were developed and then figure out how to build off of them. The one last thing before I run is, it is really critical, the Workforce Investment Act, which is the big federal funding. I think it's really important that you all have a national agenda of how you will impact that legislation and that funding going forward, along with the higher education bill, because both those bills right now do not look at the creative sector in a very intentional way. And I think there's real opportunities, particularly to talk to congressional delegations about how your industry needs to be able to be better resourced, especially using public dollars as it relates to both education and workforce. And I think you have a champion at the U.S. Chamber, and you should use that. It is their talent pipeline model that we are utilizing. And I think if you frame this as part of a talent pipeline sort of framework, I think you could get a lot of traction, especially with the congressional delegations of your states.
Thank
I
you.
have to run. I apologize. I thank you for the opportunity, and I hope I have another opportunity to speak to you when Claire and I have really launched a number of things that we can share with all of you. Again, thank you.
Thank you, Julio. Good luck. I think Julio is
Okay.
an incredible champion of thinking about a workforce system that was designed and built not for creatives, about how you can work at these policy intersections to be more equitable and to sort of open up the space. The other thing I would say for those of you who are working in state and local arts agencies is to think about our education partners as a natural partner in this talent pipeline. So the other people in your community who are thinking about creative workers a lot are people like me who run colleges and universities and who are trying very hard to make sure that the students that are leaving colleges and universities are ready to work in the really complex ecologies that our arts and creatives live in. And so I think as you're thinking about workforce, thinking about the three-legged stool of your city or local arts agency and your state arts agency, higher education and workforce are kind of natural partners that are all kind of keen to work at this intersection and make sure work is more equitable for artists, and that they're paid and contributing their talents in all the ways we know are possible. Thank you for this diversion. We're going to go back to Claire, who can kind of talk about that work, but I want to appreciate everybody's flexibility to kind of engage Julio while he's here. So Claire, back to you.
Thanks, Jen. And just to build on what Julio was saying, a lot of times I'll talk to him about, well, what about this? What about this for Illinois? And he'll say, maybe, but honestly, our best bet is to really change that WIOA legislation that he mentioned, which is the authorizing legislation for, workforce funding throughout the country. And as you can see, in his last slide there, the zero, like he always say, the zeros that go behind workforce funding are just a lot larger in scale, right, than we usually have access to in an arts and culture space in a state agency or a local arts agency. So let's take advantage of that and let's leverage that. And particularly let's think about, and I know a number of colleagues in the Getting Creative Workers Working collaborative that was active during the pandemic have been thinking about, like, what does it look like to influence WIOA and change WIOA language to be more specific around the creative economy. As Julio mentioned, that has not been the case previously, and that is a important call to action for all of us. Is some of this has to start at the top, because Julio, as flexible and as amazing as Jen says he is, which he is, he's hamstrung in some ways by the structure that he outlined to us today. So I just want to go back a little bit, Randy, to just before Julio's presentation. So just to touch on briefly some of the film pieces here in Illinois. It's just, again, like I said, within the creative workforce, it's really where we've started. Part of that is because we have an Illinois Film Office. Part of that is because we have an Illinois tax credit for film tax credit that was just expanded. I know Amanda's on the line today. She can probably talk better than I can about the Chicago Made Initiative and a pretty innovative workforce program in the city of Chicago that was actually specifically called out and prioritized within the mayor's economic recovery plan post-COVID, the post-pandemic recovery plan. So that has been getting the film industry, as Julio said, has been getting attention, it's been getting resources, and it has, I think, broader implications for our broader creative economies across the state. And then, as I said, in Illinois, the film tax credit was just expanded. And when they expanded it, they did build in, one of the things they did was allowed, for a time, they were not allowing non-resident credits for to count at all against a production's tax credit. Now, a few, not many, but a few of the non-resident parties who are involved in filmmaking in Illinois are included in the tax credit calculation. And the way they sort of offset that is by saying, all right, well, we're going to create a workforce development, because the film industry was saying we can't get all the people we need in Illinois. We need to bring outside folks in. And we would like to have credit for that business that's being, that's adding to your tax base by these folks, living and working for their projects in Illinois. And then the legislature said, well, how does that contribute to Illinoisans' jobs over the long term? And then they added this workforce development fund, which takes a piece of that film tax credit revenue and says, okay, well, we're going to actually try and find these people ultimately here in Illinois. So that's still in development. We don't know much about what that's going to look like yet, but we do happy to direct further questions to either our team over at DCASE in Chicago or the Illinois Film Office folks, if folks want to go deeper into the film workforce side. And then on the next slide, I just wanted to give a shout out to Wendy and our friends over at Arts to Work, because they too, Illinois is not the only space that is doing workforce development. Wendy Levy over in the Allied Media Initiative and Arts to Work, I'm sure many of you already know their work, and they've been doing, they actually have the only nationally certified media apprenticeship program in the country. So I think there's, a lot sort of already cooking it's that next one, that Arts to Work slide. There's not to say that Illinois is, unique, and I think a lot of folks are thinking about workforce development within the creative economy. I do think that the next program we're going to talk about, which is the Illinois Creative Workforce Activation Pilot, I would love to hear if any other states out there are thinking about pipeline development for creatives outside the creative economy in the same way, because we'd love to collaborate and learn and do some of this work together as we're developing it. So Randy, let's skip to that, which is just after Julio's presentation. Perfect. So yeah, the idea here is reimagining the future of creatives in multiple industries. I think, the reality is, especially as an arts and cultural and creative industries advocacy organization, folks will ask me when I talk about this program, what are you doing developing, creative industries pathways for folks outside the creative economy? Shouldn't you be advocating for artists to be paid fully and well enough as artists full stop, for their artistic practice? And the answer to that is, of course, yes. And that is why we have a suite of these strategies where honoring artists' work as real work, as professional work, as full-time work that needs to be paid sustainable wages is a huge part of what we're working on. But the reality is, as you all know, that's also not the world we live in right now, right? If we want to go to the next slide. And I think this is sort of the inspiration that we've kind of thought about as we were building this program. The jobs of tomorrow don't exist yet, and culture and creativity can really inform what those jobs look like. And so I think, for us, we understand that many creatives, who want to run to the next slide, do not receive the majority of their income from their creative practice, even though they are professionals, even though they are receiving some of their income from their creative practice, even though, they may have been doing it for years and years and years, right? So the idea behind this program is that we want to provide inroads to jobs, or perhaps multiple gigs. We're not sure exactly what the structure is going to look like yet on the back end, as we're just building this thing. But spaces where the creative skills are valued and their needs for financial stability and benefits are met. And particularly that they are celebrated as creatives, even though they might not be working in something that has traditionally been considered a creative industry. So what this is, again, I'll say this program does not exist yet, right? It's in development. We've been working a little bit with Jen and a number of other folks around the country on it. So just know that, take all of this with a grain of salt. You're some of the first folks outside of Illinois that are hearing us talk about this, and would love your feedback and thoughts as we're developing the ICWA. So we'll go to the next slide. This is really about longer term interventions. So as much as we've loved and we've really participated in some of these short-term pandemic-based, project-specific placements, like we have a big vaccine campaign here in Illinois, which has been fantastic. It has employed a number of artists, over 200 artists across the state, in Get Out the Vax campaigns and vaccine positive messaging. That type of thing is short-term work. What we're thinking about here is longer-term, sustainable income work, and giving them the skills and the training they need to get these jobs, both within and outside of the creative economy. We'll go to the next one. Yeah. We did a ton of research as we've started to develop this, which we can share as soon as it's official. We did a large study on the impact of COVID on the creative economy, which you all know most of that data without having to look at it. We also did a kind of a lit review of what was already out there in terms of the relationship between the creative economy and workforce. And we found, again, unsurprisingly, a lot of really great correlation between creatives in the workforce and positive outcomes, fostering innovation, reducing conflict, job readiness, empowering workers, breaking down biases. So this is some of what we use as we're starting to talk to employers about this program, as to why this workforce is really valuable to them, and a workforce that they want to engage and to value differently. We also did, as Julio started to talk about, and I think Jen mentioned too, a number of different skill analyses. So we looked at growth industries, we looked at growth occupations, both nationally, and then also overlaid that specific to Illinois. And I think these are really powerful, right? Creatives possess 100% of the power skills that are identified by leading human resource publication, HR Digest. And you'll see some of those skills there that Julio mentioned some of in his references to Deloitte and others. And then 90% of the attributes that World Economic Forum has identified in particular industries that are growth industries here: advanced manufacturing, tech, education, etc. So the shorthand here is creatives are extremely valuable, which we already knew, but there are very tangible skill maps that we can show to employers to try and talk about how their value can be made more clear in a workforce context. Getting a little more tangible on what those skills are. Again, I think just kind of lays out the Venn diagram of the power of creative workers in both industries that need them and with skills that are high demand. Excuse me. One of the things that we've heard a lot from employers as we've started doing this work, excuse me, is that toxic workplace culture is a huge challenge for them. Retention, obviously, in the Great Resignation space, another big challenge. And I think we've started to think and talk about creatives in this narrative shifting change, in this reimagination of workplace culture. So in this context, we're thinking not only of creatives as highly valuable workers, but also as folks who could really transform the culture of a place and of work. So this is sort of how we're thinking about engaging with the workforce development sector. And I think as Jen said, we're trying to create something that's pretty broken and doesn't work and has been inequitable and racist and all the things for very long, being, everything in our world, but particularly the workforce development sector. And we're trying to make it work better for creatives. And this is sort of a pathway into that. Recognizing that creatives are skilled and in demand, and then providing these creatives with the support they need to continue their creative work, providing them also not only with, what they need to do what they already do, but to do more things, right? Skills that may benefit them in a new job, but also will benefit their creative practice. And then finally, really invest in these folks and get them into stabilizing careers. We're thinking about specific populations that we're hoping would want to engage in this type of program: unemployed and underemployed creatives, BIPOC creatives, and creatives in rural places. Those who may want to replace like the 7-gig hustle for a steady income stream. And then also those specifically who want to build skills in complementary industries. So we're thinking about building out 2 pathways for this pilot. I mean, one of them probably in the pilot phase and maybe another down the road. But both engaging creatives in sort of these industry crossing jobs, some of those more transformative roles around advancing equity, around transforming workplace culture. Those are going to be not necessarily industry specific. Oh, we could transform the way workforce development even happens, right? So reimagining training programs, reimagining placement, reimagining the way workforce happens. That could be one pathway into this sector. And then the second would be a little bit more traditional when it comes to workforce, which would be taking the skills that creatives already possess, adding industry-specific occupational training, and then creating more arts integrated jobs for these creative workers. So pathway 1, as I said, is the idea that creatives with portable skills could really translate their skills across industries. And I think we have a couple examples of folks who y'all may know that are already doing this here in Illinois and elsewhere. We'll look at those next. So I think particularly these two women are, you know, examples of what that kind of transformational work can look like. And I think, you know, part of this, you know, is almost a little bit common sense, right? It's like, well, of course, creatives are doing this. They have been doing these things forever and will continue to do them forever. I think for us, it's about, you know, holding up these incredible people as examples for the workforce side of things, right? To say, yes, I mean, you know, Latrell, Nina, others have been doing this work, could do this work, are transforming a number of different sectors and industries who engage them in their work, but they haven't had a particular pathway into their careers necessarily. And I think this is the idea here is, well, what would it look like if this were clear, if there were a clear, you know, pipeline or pathway into a career like this, and if this were a real job that were, you know, sought after and clear and understood as a career. And I think that's as much what this program is about, is clarifying things that folks probably already been doing or making happen, but haven't necessarily had the skills and resources to do it. For example, we did a big focus group, or a number of different focus groups with creatives across the state as we've been working on shaping this. And folks were saying, well, yeah, I would love, you know, coding skills if I wanted to work in tech. And I took out 3 personal loans to take the classes I needed to learn how to code, because I wanted it for my artistic practice. And I also wanted to be able to get a job with those skills. And the idea here is you don't have to necessarily take out those personal loans. We can actually create paid training and placement opportunities for folks to get into these jobs. And just another great couple of examples. I know others on the phone can talk even better about Lauren. We talk about her almost in like a you know, product development and design, you know, context in terms of perception and understanding. And then Ashanti here in Illinois, really integrating her like a healthcare practice as a nurse with her poetry work. So I think the idea here is, you know, these folks are already out there integrating their creative practice with their other jobs, other selves, and what would it look like to actually transform jobs and make these, you know, jobs that folks can get and that are valued by employers, as opposed to careers that these brilliant humans sort of put together themselves. I think we'll go to the next one. So pathway 2 is this more industry specific path. So this is, hey, there's a job in advanced manufacturing and it could potentially be transformed by a sculptor who wants to learn, you know, CNC or other programming that, you know, become better at 3D printing or whatever the particular skills are within that advanced manufacturing context. You know, the artist and creative wants to learn the skill, wants to replace, again, multiple jobs that may have nothing to do with their sculpting practice with a job in the industry, but can't afford the training or doesn't have the certification they need, etc. So that's the idea here, is like, how do we create this pathway and pipeline into a job that more clearly relates to their creative practice and perhaps even amplifies and expands it. And then, you know, these are the industries that we've been talking to. Again, some of them within the creative economy, things like advertising, youth development, already have established pathways. You know, Julio, we all know Julio is talking about the teacher shortage. You know, there are tons of artists and creatives that are already well established in a youth development context. But what does it look like to, again, support them through a workforce development structure, create opportunities for that, for their training and placements to get paid for and supported, as opposed to it being such a hustle. And I think, you know, hopefully in the next few months, we will be able to roll out a bit of a pilot for you all to look at. And I think the next few slides are mostly just examples of folks that we admire who are, again, kind of already made these things happen. The links between time slips, creative practice, and health and healing, the links between, organizations like IBEAM already working at the intersection of the arts and tech. And I think the last example, is around youth development, again, which I think a lot of us already know very well in terms of its resonance. So excited to get folks' thoughts on this program. In terms of the next steps for our side, we've, in terms of structuring this, like I said, we've done a ton of work talking to creatives across Illinois who might be interested in this program. I will say that we're kind of learning that, which shouldn't be too surprising. The folks most excited about and interested in something like this are slightly earlier in their careers. Most of the mid-career creatives and artists who we talk to have said, this is cool. And were I 20 and just starting out, I'd be very interested in it, but I've sort of already figured out a way to make my life work, whether through a partner or benefits, or, making the creative practice, integrating that into life in a smaller way, or however they've had to manage that for themselves. So we are kind of looking at, I would say more of emerging or early career professionals for our pilot. But we're in the process of building this pilot right now. We have done a number of focus groups with creatives across the country. We're in the process of starting to talk to intermediaries who would be our training and placement partners in Illinois to make this happen. And then we need, a number of different, we call them unicorn employers, who are really going to embrace this, celebrate creatives for what they can bring to the table, and then employ them, once they've been trained and then we're really excited to see the research and evaluation component of this will be hugely, hugely important. What does it look like to have a small cohort of artists going through a program like this, and keep them engaged around what it's looking like in these new jobs, how it's relating to their creative practice, what skills are they gaining, are they still finding time for creative work, how supportive is their employer? These are all, critically important questions for any type of longer term intervention like this. So would be excited to chat about this work and anything else workforce that we want to touch on.
We are happy to take questions either in the Q&A or the chat. While I'm waiting for those to come in. So Claire, what is, as you work at a statewide agency, you come through the arts and arts leadership sort of sector. What has been the biggest learning for you as you've tried to translate this kind of core work with these types of state workforce agencies? Is there some sort of translational lesson learned that you feel like someone in your job who's, in Wyoming or Texas and who's trying to think about a similar pilot could, walk into a workforce agency and sort of say, hey, this is why we should talk?
Yeah, I think being armed with the data was really helpful for Julio, right? And having this skill mapping in hand is a really great starting point. As we've been developing the marketing materials for employers around this concept, not even a finished pilot, but the concept itself, we've had to think about the equation that will be most attractive to those workforce folks and to the employers themselves, right? So, when it comes to tech, it's okay, creativity, flexibility, problem solving, and innovation, plus design, aesthetic, etc. on the harder skill side, equals essentially magical employee workforce for you to think about. And so I think being able to actually name some of those skills that the creative occupations already hold was a hugely helpful kind of foot in the door as we started to talk to workforce folks. And I mean, finding finding your allies obviously is always incredibly important. I think Julio was already predisposed to our work and our industry. He didn't necessarily have a lot of background in it, but has a lot of friends in it and cares about it deeply. So he's learning about it too, right? He doesn't know us deeply. He doesn't know us well, but he wants to see this succeed. So kind of finding the right person, even if it doesn't happen to be your state workforce director, but somebody within the context of the office is, I think, very useful. And then I think also an important thing to think about as you start developing these relationships is these questions of scale. And I think that's a real challenge for us. And so it's just something you have to be really aware of. So Julio, in particular, was very excited last year about, my organization or somebody else who we identified within the creative economy becoming essentially a community navigator for their apprenticeship programs, and essentially working with cultural organizations across the state to develop apprenticeship programs. And as we started to have preliminary conversations about this, even before we filled out, the unwieldy, massive application to be a community navigator, it was quite clear that even if you were big enough to think about an apprenticeship program, which is a job, right? I mean, it's a paid earn and learn job that doesn't go away at the end of the training period. I think, that was hugely challenging for a lot of our arts and culture stakeholders to think about, well, could this turn into a permanent job? I think moving our sector from a unpaid internship to an apprenticeship context is about job creation. And I think that's really hard for us to think about at scale, given the very small nature of most of the businesses we work with, both on the for-profit and nonprofit side. And I think the workforce folks are much more used to dealing with larger scale business.
And I think one of the things that our sector can think about then is how do we take the assets that we have and configure them into a larger scale? So an example, and this is a cited example in the Opportunities at the Intersection report, which is also on the GIA website, where we talk about, from an equity and policy standpoint, how the workforce system is kind of advancing equity. And one of those areas is opportunity youth. So underemployed or underskilled young people 18 to 24. There's a whole network of programs in the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. Many states and localities have actually had high success with working with young people in creative occupations and apprenticeship programs in the kind of opportunity youth section. And a lot of the success, we cite examples from Nashville and New Jersey, there's examples in Texas and California, where smaller art service organizations, even individual artist studios, have worked as a consortium, right, with a local arts agency or a state arts agency, allowing those smaller arts footprints to act as hubs, hosting maybe 1 or 2 student workers or opportunity youth workers who are upskilling or side skilling themselves. So that same kind of mental set to get to the scale that workforce is trying to look at is an opportunity for us as local arts leaders and state arts leaders to think about, well, how do we use the mechanism that is at work, that was meant to sort of upskill a post-industrialist workforce into basically like factory jobs, right? That's the structure that this thing currently hinges on. Yep. While we're working at fixing that, because that's got a lot of problems, including wage equity attached to it, how do we show up in that sector so that our needs as workers are more visible? Because the underlying policy, some of the underlying issues is because our workers are not seen in that system, we're not centered in that system, which means some of the worker protections that you led off with keep getting erased, which is why Julio is articulating we need to show up in this reauthorization, because our workers and creative workers need to be seen in spaces. But the ways we begin to visibilize that are to kind of lean into some of these structures and sort of say, oh, we can't show up in that. We just can't show up in that as, my museum is not going to radically employ 300 people, but my museum and that museum and this art center and that community sound studio could work together as a consortia, and together we might be able to push the lift up, right? So it requires, and in doing that, it also facilitates that, like that flatter community self-determination, which I think is one of the things we're all trying to move towards, right? How are we sort of moving voice and power out as we create these systems that are less log jammed with one gatekeeper, but more flat and more of it with community. Questions, hand raises.
You sort of opened the door there, Jen. So I wanted to ask Claire, Claire, I know you run a statewide advocacy organization. I know you're part of many networks, including Creative States Coalition. I heard Julio very clearly speak to the need for a national agenda around the WIOA reauthorization. What are ways folks on this call might engage that? How do we go from our home communities towards a collaborative agenda that might influence WIOA's inclusion of creative workforce?
Yeah, I mean, it is a great question. I think I think you have to, I mean, well, I think most of the folks on this, depending on where you're coming from, right? If you're in a state and local arts agency, you're hopefully already engaged with your advocacy organization at the state or local level. And I think this is something to flag with them. I think to say, where are we on this? What is the opportunity here? I think, the Cultural Advocacy Group, Americans for the Arts, CSC, PAA, some of the new advocacy structures that are evolving. We probably need to get our friends, NEVA and folks on the for-profit side doing advocacy work involved in this. This is one where I think we could probably do a big lift together. I think this is going to be, thanks Randy on that one. I think, this isn't going to be too contentious within the field, right? I think it could actually be pretty unifying to help folks understand that the individual artists and creative workers that we all serve in a variety of capacities, one way or the other, could be hugely benefited from inclusion and the expansion of WIOA to directly impact the creative sector. I think we could probably make a case for all of those different interest groups and constituencies and why it's important for their stakeholders to get involved in something like this. So it is going to require, I think, that level of rowing in the same direction, which we are not always the best at as a sector. But I think everyone here, whomever they work with in the advocacy space, and if you don't know who that is on your in your space, please feel free to connect with me, and I'm sure we can find the right node for that. But I do think it's a hugely important question, and we need to come together on it, even though we're all really tired after the last few years, particularly in the advocacy space. But
the other thing I would say, Claire, is it's an opportunity for us to work in adjacencies with other people already working in our communities who might not be centering creative workers, that are working on the same worker protections and sort of visibility of gig and other, what
exactly
understood as the tenor, gig workforce. So, freelancers union,
totally.
Lots of local independent worker coalitions in farm work and agricultural work and other kinds of based labor forces in gig organizing. I think a lot of those folks will have the same worker protection advocacy platforms. The other two places I would encourage folks to dig into if they have not are the Aspen Institute Future of Work research and coalitions that often function at the state level. So a lot of that is really identifying this larger issue of worker protection and kind of how we galvanize independent and creative workers towards the new work future. And same thing with the National Skills Coalition, which are folks really working at the state, local, and regional level on sort of lifting up and upskilling sort of underinvested in and folks who are maybe undereducated for the future workforce, right? And so really what does that look like at a community level, driven by local leadership? So I think that those are Yes, Kelly, yes, Kevin, yes, universities can be partners. I work at one of those, and I would say, yes, universities are often kind of also left out of this conversation and are working rapidly based on their own student population to change the relevance of the things that they're teaching in university to this rapidly shifting workforce. And so I think reimagining partners, reimagining folks who are already in these advocacy realms, and then continuing to work at visibilizing how creative workers are contributing to some of these adjacent professions. I think of all the work the University of Florida has done, and National Organization of Art and Health has done on sort of thinking about health-based occupations that creative workers are currently occupying and can occupy, and sort of how do we begin to identify partners in some of these other sectors to make that translation just as strong.
Yeah, I think just to add on that, Jen, we were, you know, and I think again, some of this is like happenstance, and if you don't know where to go to seek it out, it's like, you know, how do you know how to even where to begin? But I think that those future work coalitions, I think, are really, really important. That's a space where we happen to know the convener, and through Department of Commerce, we're connected to them again, actually in another through another contact. But I think the convener of the Future of Work group here in Illinois has become an incredible partner for us. Their organization called Economic Security of Illinois, doing a lot of really interesting work around cash assistance programs, around worker stability, around all kinds of issues that we care a lot about, but haven't necessarily led on in the past. And so we're actually, they're inviting us to be a kind of a key part of an ongoing roundtable going forward around some of these worker protections issues and future of work issues that again, and they're really realistic about it because of the breadth of stakeholders you bring to a table in a conversation like that. Not everybody's going to agree on everything all the time in terms of policy intervention, you know, particularly when you have like unions and employers and, you know, nonprofit groups and advocate. I mean, it's a whole host of folks who care about the future of work, right? So, but they're committed to keeping the dialogue together and really, you know, connecting around maintaining the conversation, even if folks, where even maybe a segment of them will take an action on something together, as opposed to perhaps the whole network. So I think that really key, the arts doesn't necessarily have to lead on a lot of this stuff. I think we just need to be involved and at the table for these conversations. Yes, we can share the slide deck.
Yeah, and just to reiterate what we said at the beginning, this entire presentation will be archived and shared on the Grantmakers in the Arts websites, which you can go back and relook at this presentation, including the slides and any others. Not seeing any additional questions, I want to thank everybody for attending today and draw your attention to our next presentation, our next public learning series on Wednesday, August 31st. Where Care Lab will be talking about individual artist support as a policy mechanism and tool, and sort of innovations there. And making sure I'm looking at my chat to make sure I've got everything. And
Jen, there was one housekeeping note we wanted to make sure people, the website had said September 7th for our 8th and final session, also with Care Lab, focused on artists in residencies and cultural strategists. That is in fact going to be on September 14th. Following the every other week cadence. If you registered, you will get an email clarifying that. Also, thank you for registering. And yeah, just we have, this was amazing. Thank you, Claire. We have next week with Care Lab, or 2 weeks from now with Care Lab on the 31st, and then September 14th will bring us to the close. Sorry, Jen, back to you.
No, it's good. Thank you for the housekeeping. So make that date change. Care Lab is our incredible coalition of humans working at the artist supporting artist residency space, and we'll look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you, Claire. In absentia, thank you, Julio. Please go advocate for the WIELA Reauthorization Act and create its voice in that. And thanks, everyone. Thanks, GIA.